This is Monica Perez, and we are here today with the penultimate reading and discussion of Report from Iron Mountain. We will finish the main book, but next week there's all sorts of appendices, and addenda and apologia, I might say, from Leonard Lewin and the whole cast of characters to try to debunk what they themselves put out there. And I find that all of that quite interesting. We'll discuss that at length next week. But right now, let us continue with this. But yes, first, let's acknowledge that, and Stella is saying RIP Ozzy. So Ozzy Osbourne died today, and I had the privilege of seeing him in Birmingham 2 weeks ago in England, where I ran into Noble, our friend from CFR, William from England. I really had a Monica Perez show extravaganza, but it was a 10-hour heavy metal fest. I mean, it was just amazing. And it's the only context in which I could hear things like Slayer and Anthrax and Tool and Alice in Chains, because it was an outdoor stadium. So like I could not stand 10 hours of that loudness inside, especially Tool. So it was really, really a treat for me. Ozzy definitely looked like he was on his last legs. As a matter of fact, he wasn't on his legs at all, but he seemed very happy. 40,000 people were there. You could feel the love. All his crosses were right side up. So as my friend who was there said, there are no atheists in foxholes. So there's no unforgivable sin. One of only two is despair. There's no despair. We pray that he achieves salvation. And I will recommend that. I saw him, Black Sabbath, in Hyde Park 11 years ago, 2014. That was an amazing concert. Amazing. And he said that he's been laid up for 6 years. So it was 5 years before that. You know not the day nor the hour, saith the Lord. So but anyway, it was really a joyful experience. And if all his fans say one little prayer, I'm sure he will overcome much. So here we go. I know, Prince of Darkness. Like, is that really how you want to go out? Oh wow, Stella saw them in Sydney. Probably earlier than my Hyde Park show. I'm assuming that they were absolutely fantastic. And I wanted, actually, since Stella's here, I've been thinking about this quote. It sounds dark, but it's a good quote. And it reminded me when we were talking about we're talking about Joe Tundra, and that this loss of somebody of value, a person of value, and other losses that I experienced over the past 12 months are incomprehensible. Really incomprehensible, in my opinion. And it reminded me of a quote that my son and it comes up more than you would think, by, I'm going to say, Aeschylus, Aeschylus. It is, and I think this is in one of those, just by coincidence, in a Gojira song, which is French, but they say it in English, and I'm sure this is Greek. Okay. He who learns must suffer. And even in our sleep, pain that cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart. And in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom to us by the awful grace of God. That's a deep one. I used to know that by heart. It's really serious. He who learns must suffer. And wisdom comes to us by the awful grace of God. So I recommend that quote. I think of just the incomprehensibility of some losses, and then others are, come when the time is due. So anyway, let us commence. Hi, Harry. Amen to you too, Stella. She liked that. Okay, so let's pick up where we left off. We were in the chapter called Substitutes for the Functions of War, and the sub chapter was political. These are substitutes for the functions of war, political functions of war. So he says the war system makes the stable government of societies possible. It does this essentially by providing an external necessity for a society to accept political rule. In so doing, it establishes the basis for nationhood and the authority of government to control its constituents. What other institution or combination of programs might serve these functions in its place? We have already pointed out that the end of war means the end of national sovereignty, and thus the end of nationhood as we know it today. But this does not necessarily mean the end of nations in the administrative sense, and internal political power will remain essential to a stable society. The emerging nations of the peace epoch must continue to draw political authority from some source. A number of proposals have been made governing the relations between nations after total disarmament. All are basically juridical in nature. They contemplate institutions more or less like a world court or a United Nations, but vested with real authority. They may or may not serve their ostensible post-military purpose of settling international disputes, but we need not discuss that here. None would offer effective external pressure on a peace world nation to organize itself politically. This is a really important chapter. So hopefully the words speak for themselves. If I have the thoughts, I'll tell you, but I'll try to enunciate clearly so nothing is lost. It might be argued that a well-armed international police force, this is so interesting, operating under the authority of such a supranational court could well serve the function of external enemy. I mean, we talk about that. I named a cocktail Blue Helmet because of how scary the blue helmets are, how much you do not want them in your country. But think of that. They would establish an international police force to scare you into wanting the authority to protect you from them. Really interesting. So I go back and forth with saying, are they looking for nation states in order to have their little fiefdoms, or are they looking for a world government? And I think, maybe they're looking for both. This, however, would constitute a military operation, like the inspection schemes mentioned, and like them would be inconsistent with the premise of an end to the war system. It is possible that a variant of the, quote, unarmed forces idea might be developed in such a way that its constructive, that is, social welfare activities, could be combined with an economic threat of sufficient size and credibility to warrant political organization. Would this kind of threat also be contradictory to our basic premise? That is, would it be inevitably military? Not necessarily, in our view, but we are skeptical of its capacity to evoke credibility. Also, the obvious destabilizing effect of any global social welfare surrogate on politically necessary class relationships would create an entirely new set of transition problems, at least equal in magnitude. Credibility, in fact, lies at the heart of the problem of developing a political substitute for war. This is where the space race proposals, in many ways so well suited as economic substitutes for war, fall short. The most ambitious and unrealistic space project cannot of itself generate a believable external menace. It has been hotly argued that such a menace would offer the last best hope of peace by uniting mankind against the danger of destruction by creatures from other planets or from outer space. I always think that microbes are the trillions of invisible monsters trying to kill us all. That's where they landed. Experiments have been proposed to test the credibility of an out-of-our-world invasion threat. It is possible that a few more of the more difficult to explain flying saucer incidents of recent years were in fact early experiments of this kind. If so, they could hardly have been judged encouraging. We anticipate no difficulties in making a, quote, need for a giant super space program credible for economic purposes, even were there not ample precedent. Extending it for political purposes to include features unfortunately associated with science fiction would obviously be a more dubious undertaking. Stella has a little funny about my my blue helmet cocktail thingy. Does it taste like a Molotov cocktail? Dude, I actually should make a Molotov cocktail. I have Scrappy's habanero bitters. I think it would start with that. Nevertheless, an effective political substitute for war would require alternate enemies, some of which might seem equally far-fetched in the context of the current war system. It may be, for instance, that gross pollution of the environment can eventually replace the possibility of mass destruction by nuclear weapons as the principal apparent threat to the survival of the species. So, gross pollution of the environment, poisoning of the air and of the principal sources of food and water is already well advanced, and at first glance would seem promising in this respect. These people are sick. It constitutes a threat that can be dealt with only through social organization and political power. But from present indications, again, I don't believe that. If you have bad food, get rid of the FDA. Have people feel responsible for choosing. Same thing with the drugs and everything else. Have them responsible for choosing. But from present indications, it will be a generation to a generation and a half before environmental pollution, however severe, would be sufficiently menacing on a global scale to offer a possible basis for a solution. I mean, we can see how the climate change thing, CO2 as the pollutant, which is hilarious because you can't get rid of it and it's not bad. It's naturally occurring, is where they went with this. Anyway, it is true that the rate of pollution could be increased selectively for this purpose. In fact, the mere modifying of existing programs for the deterrence of pollution could speed up the process enough to make the threat credible much sooner. But the pollution problem has been so widely publicized in recent years that it seems highly improbable that a program of deliberate environmental poisoning could be implemented in a politically acceptable manner. However unlikely some of the possible alternate enemies we have mentioned may seem, we must emphasize that one must be found of credible quality and magnitude if a transition to peace is ever to come about without social disintegration. It is more probable, in our judgment, that such a threat will have to be invented rather than developed from unknown conditions. For this reason, we believe further speculation about its putative nature ill-advised in this context. Since there is considerable doubt in our minds that any viable political surrogate can be devised, we are reluctant to compromise by premature discussion any possible option that may eventually lie open to our government. So they're not telling you their actual ideas, which I would say is the climate change thing. Okay. And the space stuff, the aliens were definitely going. They have not given up on the UFO idea, that's for sure. And maybe that's what a lot of this alternate media that focuses on that stuff is for, really long game to get people in that mindset. All right, the next substitute for the function of war is sociological. Of the many functions of war we have found convenient to group together in this classification, two are critical. In a world of peace, the continuing stability of society will require, one, an effective substitute for military institutions that can neutralize destabilizing social elements, and two, a credible motivational surrogate for war that can ensure social cohesiveness. The first is an essential element of social control. The second is the basic mechanism for adapting individual human drives to the needs of society. I have to do that again. I'm not great with the sociology. Okay. An effective substitute for military institutions that can neutralize destabilizing social elements. Okay. I feel like having everybody go to 4-year college is part of that. And getting rid of SATs and whatnot. Okay. 2, a credible motivational surrogate for war that can ensure social cohesiveness. Motivational? That's what I guess I'm stumbling on that. It's the basic mechanism for adapting individual human drives to the needs of society. Okay, let's keep reading. Most proposals that address themselves, explicitly or otherwise, to the post war problem of controlling the socially alienated turn to some variant of the Peace Corps or the so called Job Corps for a solution. The socially disaffected, the economically unprepared, the psychologically unconformable, the hardcore delinquents, the incorrigible subversives, and the rest of the unemployable are seen as somehow transformed by the disciplines of a service modeled on military precedent into more or less dedicated social service workers. This presumption also informs the otherwise hard-headed ratiocination of the unarmed forces plan. By the way, having all those people on drugs and laying in the gutters does neutralize them. So I think they definitely did some of that. And putting them all on welfare and having them not want to work and keep your head down and just check out, that's part of the, I think that is part of the plan. All right, the problem has been addressed in the language of popular sociology by Secretary McNamara. Even in our abundant societies, we have reason enough to worry over the tensions that coil and tighten among underprivileged young people, and finally flail out in delinquency and crime. What are we to expect where mounting frustrations are likely to fester into eruptions of violence and extremism? In a seemingly unrelated passage, he continues, it seems to me that we could move toward remedying that inequity of the selective service system by asking every young person in the United States to give 2 years of service to his country, whether in one of the military services, in the Peace Corps, or in some other volunteer developmental work at home or abroad. We could encourage other countries to do the same. Here, as elsewhere throughout this significant speech, Mr. McNamara has focused indirectly but unmistakably on one of the key issues bearing on a possible transition to peace, and has later indicated, also indirectly, a rough approach to its resolution, again phrased in the language of the current war system. It seems clear that Mr. McNamara and other proponents of the Peace Corps surrogate for this war function lean heavily on the success of the paramilitary depression programs mentioned in the last section. We find the precedent wholly inadequate in degree. Neither the lack of relevant precedent, however, nor the dubious social welfare sentimentality characterizing this approach warrant its rejection without careful study. It may be viable, provided first that the military origin of the core format be effectively rendered out of its operational activity, and second, that the transition from paramilitary activities to, quote, developmental work can be effected without regard to the attitudes of the core personnel or to the value of the work it is expected to perform. Another possible surrogate for the control of potential enemies of society is the reintroduction. This is a classic. The reintroduction in some form consistent with modern technology and political processes of slavery. Up to now, this has been suggested only in fiction, notably in the works of Wells, Huxley, Orwell, and others engaged in the imaginative anticipation of the sociology of the future. But the fantasies projected in Brave New World and 1984 have seemed less and less implausible over the years since their publication. The traditional association of slavery with ancient pre-industrial cultures should not blind us to its adaptability to advanced forms of social organization, nor should its equally traditional incompatibility with Western moral and economic values. It is entirely possible that the development of a sophisticated form of slavery may be an absolute prerequisite for social control in a world at peace. They do say slave to debt, slave to drugs. As a practical matter, conversion of the code of military discipline to a euphemized form of enslavement would entail surprisingly little revision. The logical first step would be the adoption of some form of universal military service. When it comes to postulating a credible substitute for war capable of directing human behavior patterns on behalf of social organizations. Oh, tax slave. Yes. Still a tax slave. Now I hear you. I think every one of us falls into one of those categories. A tax slave, slave to debt, or a slave to drugs, or all of those things. When it comes to postulating a credible substitute for war capable of directing human behavior patterns on behalf of social organization, few options suggest themselves. Like its political function, the motivational function of war requires the existence of a genuinely menacing social enemy. The principal difference is that for purposes of motivating basic allegiance, as distinct from accepting political authority, the alternate enemy must imply a more immediate, tangible, and directly felt threat of destruction. It must, I remember this one now, it must justify the need for taking and paying a blood price in wide areas of human concern. I don't know if this is Girardian or what, but I'm going to be talking to Scott and William about this book in August. So we shall see what they say. I should put a little noogie on here. I imagine this book has probably got some monetary value. Probably don't want to write in it. I write in a lot of books. Okay. In this respect, the possible substitute enemies noted earlier would be insufficient. One exception might be the environmental pollution model, if the danger to society it posed was genuinely imminent. The fictive models would have to carry the weight of extraordinary conviction, underscored with a not inconsiderable actual sacrifice of life. This really sounds like the climate change thing. The construction of an up-to-date mythological or religious structure for this purpose would present difficulties in our era, but must certainly be considered. An up-to-date mythological religion, that is so environmentalism. Can anybody think of anything else that would fit this? I'm definitely saying climate change fits this. It's got religious aspects. It involves real loss of life. It's delivered with blood-curdling seriousness, gravitas. And then war itself, they're still promoting war. So this thing was a failure, although now they have all those other things that they're doing as well. Games theorists have suggested in other contexts the development of blood games for the effective control of individual aggressive impulses. Do we have blood games? Well, we have video games. We have proxy blood games. It is an ironic commentary on the current state of war and peace studies that it was left not to scientists, but to the makers of a commercial film to develop a model for this notion on the implausible level of popular melodrama as a ritualized manhunt. I can't think of what in the 60s was it that, well, the Planet of the Apes? I mean, I can't remember. Ritualized manhunt in the 60s. I cannot remember. More realistically, such a ritual might be socialized in the manner of the Spanish Inquisition and the less formal witch trials of other periods for purposes of social purification, state security, or other rationale both acceptable and credible to post-war societies. The feasibility of such an updated version of still another ancient institution, though doubtful, is considerably less fanciful than the wishful notion of many peace planners that a lasting condition of peace can be brought about without the most painstaking examination of every possible surrogate for the essential functions of war. What is involved here, in a sense, is the quest for William James's moral equivalent of war. You know, something I realized when I was watching Mr. Robot, that was like some kind of cable TV series. And in the beginning, they it occurred to me that us like hating the federal government, like that we have by us all hating the government, we may be abandoning the higher threat, or, you know, the state versus the federal government maybe is part of that we were weakening the federal government in favor of the state, like me, you know, I prefer states' rights, but that the federal government is the one thing that actually has the power to stop the super evil overlords, the world government. Anyway, because hatred for the federal government is fomented. Like the January 6th thing was fomented. I don't know. Anyway, I get that kind of thinking from this thing. Okay. It's also possible that the two functions considered under this heading may be jointly served in the sense of establishing the antisocial for whom a control institution is needed as the alternate enemy needed to hold society together. This is a good one. The relentless and irreversible advance of unemployability at all levels of society and the similar extension of generalized alienation from accepted values may make some such program necessary even as an adjunct to the war system. As before, we will not speculate on the specific forms this kind of program might take, except to note that there is again ample precedent in the treatment meted out to disfavored, already menacing ethnic groups in certain societies during certain historical periods. So they want to demonize minorities. So we have lots of minorities that we are demonizing. And I just think right now, Blacks and Jews are very much like openly demonized now. Now that's 50 years after this thing, or 60 after this thing was published. But they're saying you still need to do that. Plus, I'd seen that thing that said you want to promote dysfunctional subcultures. So getting people to destroy the system is also, a setup. And as Stella says, in the us versus them, there are many thems. So maybe the idea is you can destroy the thems, but unless you get them all, you are destroying them on behalf of the other thems, right? Isn't that how you do it? Like, I feel like every revolution, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, some behind the scenes thing got the disgruntled to take the government out. And then 10 years, like almost exactly, I think in all three of their cases, there was a second revolution where that shadowy whatever got in and got what they wanted, because the rabble that took out the first government at that shadowy promote, they didn't really have any real power, didn't have a real plan. They were, and didn't expect this. They just created a vacuum that the other one could fill. Weaponized immigration, of course. There are so many despised minorities. What does he say? What is he calling them? Was it despised minority? Yeah. Disfavored ethnic groups. That's what he says. Anyway, yeah, very true. It's certainly happening everywhere. And everybody has their own. Everyone's in one. Even white people are in a despised ethnic group. All right, ecological. Considering the shortcomings of war as a mechanism of selective population control, it might appear that devising substitutes for this function should be comparatively simple. Schematically, this is so, but the problem of timing the transition to a new ecological balancing device makes the feasibility of substitution less certain. It must be remembered that the limitation of war in this function is entirely eugenic. War has not been genetically progressive, but as a system of gross population control to preserve the species, it cannot fairly be faulted. And as has been pointed out, the nature of war is itself in transition. Current trends in warfare, the increased strategic bombing of civilians, and the greater military importance now attached to the destruction of sources of supply, as opposed to purely military bases and personnel, strongly suggest that a truly qualitative improvement is in the making. Oh my gosh, these people. Assuming the war system is to continue, it is more than probable that the regressive selective quality of war will have been reversed as its victims become more genetically representative of their societies. Or, like with COVID, old people, handicapped people, fat people. Yeah. But then they went and vaxxed everybody. This is a mystery I think we need to figure out. Did they vax all those people? Because they don't really give a care if you're liberal or conservative or conformist or nonconformist, that they just need to take people out. Or maybe the jab, I think I said the V word, and that in itself will jeopardize my video. But that in itself may also be progressive rather than regressive, if you want to use the terms in this book, that it will take out the vulnerable, that the strong can withstand it. I think that's probably true. Yeah, it was a bioweapon, Harry says. True that. Used against our own people. I mean, if you don't think we have a pathocracy after that, and a world government for that matter, there is no... Hey, did you notice, like, my mom is gone? I can hardly do my mom anymore, but I'm going to visit her grave in a couple of weeks. It's approaching my parents' wedding anniversary, and I'll see some family. Maybe we'll jog some memories, and I'll come back with some goodies I can tell you in her voice. But see, if it's not a quote, I can't do it. I cannot channel her if it's not a quote. Anyway, there's no question but that a universal requirement that procreation be limited to the products of artificial insemination would provide a fully adequate substitute control for population levels. Such a reproductive system would, of course, have the added advantage of being susceptible of direct eugenic management. That's always great. You know what would happen? Do you know what would happen if things would be really screwed up? I was redoing my bathroom when I moved into this house, and I arranged the tiles. They were just random, handmade tiles, so they were a little different. On the wall, you can see patterns. You can see that there was somebody picking, and that's not what you want, because you will really skew. First of all, everyone would have blue eyes. Women would look like Barbie dolls, like huge boobs, but you have sexual dimorphism. So you would have super masculine guys, but super feminine. I don't know how it would work, but I'm not preferring it. Such a reproductive system would, of course, have the added advantage of being direct human. Its predictable further development, conception, and embryonic growth taking place wholly under laboratory conditions would extend these controls to their logical conclusion. The ecological function of war under these circumstances would not only be superseded, but surpassed in effectiveness. This is in the 60s. I remember the first test tube baby. And I remember my crazy brother used to make fun of all the protest movements. He was a complete hippie junkie guy who lived in his van, but he would come around and he would march up and down the street with the Black Power fist saying equal rights for test tube babies, equal rights for test tube babies. Because there was just one test tube baby, and that was in the 70s. The indicated intermediate step, total control of conception with a variant of the ubiquitous pill via water supplies or certain essential foodstuffs. I'm thinking epicite, the spermicidal corn that also wasn't, I don't think, invented till the 80s, if not the 90s, offset by a controlled, quote, antidote, is already under development. You think? There would appear to be no foreseeable need to revert to any of the outmoded practices referred to in the previous section, infanticide, etc., as there might have been if the possibility of transition to peace had arisen 2 generations ago. The real question here, therefore, does not concern the viability of this war substitute, but the political problems involved in bringing it about. It cannot be established while the war system is still in effect. The reason for this is simple. Excess population is war material. As long as any society must contemplate even a remote possibility of war, it must maintain a maximum supportable population, even when so doing critically aggravates an economic liability. This is paradoxical in view of war's role in reducing excess population, but it is readily understood. War controls the general population level, but the ecological interest of any single society lies in maintaining its hegemony vis-a-vis other societies. The obvious analogy can be seen in any free enterprise economy. Practices damaging to the society as a whole, both competitive and monopolistic, are abetted by the conflicting economic motives of individual capital interests. The obvious precedent can be found in the seemingly irrational political difficulties which have blocked universal adoption of simple birth control methods. Nations desperately in need of increasing unfavorable production consumption ratios are nevertheless unwilling to gamble their possible military requirements of 20 years hence for this purpose. Unilateral population control, as practiced in ancient Japan and in other isolated societies, is out of the question in today's world. Surely he knew drones were coming and the need for human soldiers diminishing, wouldn't you think? Since the eugenic solution cannot be achieved until the transition to the peace system takes place, why not wait? One must qualify the inclination to agree. As we noted earlier, a real possibility of an unprecedented global crisis of insufficiency exists today, which the war system may not be able to forestall. If this should come to pass before an agreed upon transition to peace were completed, the result might be irrevocably disastrous. There is clearly no solution to this dilemma. It is a risk which must be taken, but it tends to support the view that if a decision is made to eliminate the war system, it were better done sooner than later. Some of this reads like scaremongering, fear-mongering, because they want to make radical changes. They want to introduce some of this stuff without getting rid of war, or maybe because they thought they had to get rid of war. Maybe they thought people were just not going to stand for it anymore. And not that they wanted to, but they had to figure out how to deal with that. But you can see that disasters, now the LA fires did not involve a lot of loss of life, but it certainly is generating a lot of business, you know. But think of the wars, Ukraine, Gaza, Syria. 400,000 people died in Syria. 40,000, 50, 60,000 probably in Gaza. Ukraine, I mean, with the soldiers, they're talking about, I mean, 1 million is some of the estimates. Just on one side, I heard. I don't necessarily believe that, but so they're definitely still wiping out a lot of people. Now, when you're talking about billions of people, the COVID stuff was definitely more effective at that. It wasn't in one day, but we can see it. Like, I'm sure I'm guessing the population will go down. My guess is the population 10 years from now will be lower than it is today. Wow, that's really radical. I don't know if that's possible. Certainly in the West. Okay. Barring immigration, which there isn't. But anyway, okay. Cultural and scientific substitutes. Strictly speaking, the function of war as the determinant of cultural values and as the prime mover of scientific progress may not be critical in a world without war. Our criterion for the basic non-military functions of war has been, are they necessary to the survival and stability of society? The absolute need for substitute cultural value determinants and for the continued advance of scientific knowledge is not established. We believe it important, however, in behalf of those for whom these functions hold subjective significance, that it be known that they can reasonably expect in culture and science after a transition to peace, what they can expect. So far as the creative arts are concerned, there is no reason to believe they would disappear, but only that they would change in character and relative social importance. The elimination of war would in due course deprive them of their principal conative force? Not familiar. Conative force. But it would necessarily take some time for the effect of this withdrawal to be felt. During the transition, and perhaps for a generation thereafter, themes of socio-moral conflict inspired by the war system would be increasingly transferred to the idiom of purely personal sensibility. At the same time, a new aesthetic would have to develop. Whatever its name, form, or rationale, its function would be to express, in language appropriate to the new period, the once discredited philosophy that art exists for its own sake. This aesthetic would reject unequivocally the classic requirement of paramilitary conflict as the substantive content of great art. The eventual effect of the peace world philosophy of art would be democratizing in the extreme, in the sense that a generally acknowledged subjectivity of artistic standards would equalize their new content-free values. If they had a substitute, however, I believe that if they had a substitute like pestilence or whatever plague, which is what they obviously are trying to do, you have that conflict, angst, loss, you have that stuff. And for goodness sake, we certainly have basically political war going on. I mean, there's plenty of conflictual fodder for art now. What may be expected to happen is that art would be reassigned the role it once played in a few primitive, peace-oriented social systems. This was the function of pure decoration, entertainment, or play, entirely free of the burden of expressing the socio-moral values and conflicts of a war-oriented society. It is interesting that the groundwork for such a value-free aesthetic is already being laid today, in growing experimentation in art without content, perhaps in anticipation of a world without conflict. A cult has developed around a new kind of cultural determinism, which proposes that the technological form of a cultural expression determines its values rather than does its ostensibly meaningful content. Technological form of a cultural expression. I mean, maybe that's what AI is. It's going to be art without content and artists. And maybe they're okay with AI replacing artists because they don't think art's going to be here. Now, again, this was a long time ago, and we do not look like they're doing away with war. Its clear implication is that there is no good or bad art, only that which is appropriate to its technological times and that which is not. Its cultural effect has been to promote circumstantial constructions and unplanned expressions. It denies to art the relevance of sequential logic. Its significance in this context is that it provides a working model of one kind of value-free culture we might reasonably anticipate in a world at peace. So far as science is concerned, it might appear at first glance that a giant space research program, the most promising among the promised economic surrogates for war, might also serve as the basic stimulator of scientific research. The lack of fundamental organized social conflict inherent in space work, however, would rule it out as an adequate motivational substitute for war when applied to pure science. But it could no doubt sustain the broad range of technological activity that a space budget of military dimensions would require. A similarly scaled social welfare program could provide a comparable impetus to low-keyed technological advances, especially in medicine, rationalized construction methods, educational psychology, etc. The eugenic substitute for the ecological function of war would also require continuing research in certain areas of the life sciences. Apart from these partial substitutes for war, it must be kept in mind that the momentum given to scientific progress by the great wars of the past century, and even more by the anticipation of World War III, is intellectually and materially enormous. It is our finding that if the war system were to end tomorrow, this momentum is so great that the pursuit of scientific knowledge could reasonably be expected to go forward without noticeable diminution for perhaps 2 decades. It would then continue at a progressively decreasing tempo for at least another 2 decades before the bank account of today's unresolved problems would become exhausted. Is he not even anticipating artificial intelligence? I find that hard to believe the way these guys were so ahead of it. And Zbigniew Brzezinski wrote stuff like that in the early, like 1971 in America in the technotronic era. By the standards of the questions we have learned to ask today, there would be no longer anything worth knowing still unknown. We cannot conceive by definition of the scientific questions to ask once those we can now comprehend are answered. This leads unavoidably to another matter, the intrinsic value of the unlimited search for knowledge. We, of course, offer no independent value judgments here, but it is germane to point out that a substantial minority of scientific opinion feels that search to be circumscribed in any case. This opinion is itself a factor in considering the need for a substitute for the scientific function of war. For the record, we must also take note of the precedent that during long periods of human history, often covering thousands of years, in which no intrinsic social value was assigned to scientific progress, stable societies did survive and flourish. Although this could not have been possible in the modern industrial world, we cannot be certain it may not again be true in a future world at peace. All right, there's more to this than I thought. We'll keep reading. Okay. The nature of war. Okay, this is section 7, summary and conclusions. The nature of war. War is not, as is widely assumed, primarily an instrument of policy utilized by nations to extend or defend their expressed political values or their economic interests. On the contrary, it is itself the principal basis of organization on which all modern societies are constructed. The common proximate cause of war is the apparent interference of one nation with the aspirations of another. But at the root of all ostensible differences of national interest lie the dynamic requirements of the war system itself for periodic armed conflict. Readiness for war characterizes contemporary social systems more broadly than their economic and political structures, which it subsumes. Economic analysis of the anticipated problems of transition to peace have not recognized the broad preeminence of war in the definition of social systems. The same is true with rare and only partial exceptions of model disarmament scenarios. For this reason, the value of this previous work is limited to the mechanical aspects of transitions. Certain features of these models may perhaps be applicable to a real situation of conversion to peace. This will depend on their compatibility with a substantive rather than a procedural peace plan. Such a plan can be developed only from the premise of full understanding of the nature of the war system it proposes to abolish, which in turn presupposes detailed comprehension of the functions of the war system, performs for society. It will require the construction of a detailed and feasible system of substitutes for those functions that are necessary to the stability and survival of human societies. I would say this particular human society with the hierarchical structure that these guys are trying to preserve. Thank you for the like. If you're listening, watching, smash the like button. Smash the heart or the thumb. The functions of war. All right. I think we'll read the functions of war, a few of the other summaries, and then I think we're going to save the recommendations for next time, and then all the like backpedaling, whitewashing. But if you want to listen to this without commercials, and you're listening audio wise, please join my Substack. So join it anyway, just for free. But if you want to get this stuff without commercials, become a paid subscriber and get that and more bonus content as well. Anyway, the functions of war. The visible military function of war requires no elucidation. It is not only obvious, but also irrelevant to a transition to the condition of peace in which it will, by definition, be superfluous. It is also subsidiary in social significance to the implied non-military functions of war. Those critical to transition can be summarized in 5 principal groupings. It's got a paragraph on each. Economic. War has provided both ancient and modern societies with a dependable system for stabilizing and controlling national economies. No alternate method of control has yet been tested in a complex modern economy that has shown itself remotely comparable in scope or effectiveness. 2, political. The permanent possibility of war is the foundation for stable government. It supplies the basis for general acceptance of political authority. It has enabled societies to maintain necessary class distinctions, and it has ensured the subordination of the citizen to the state by virtue of the residual war powers inherent in the concept of nationhood. No modern political ruling group has successfully controlled its constituency after failing to sustain the continuing credibility of an external threat of war. Boy, in my lifetime, that's true. I have never heard a president not worry about war. Maybe, I was too young to know in the 70s, but I think we had the Red Scare still. Yeah, of course. The sociological one. Okay, that's number 3. Oh, yeah. There's no commercials if you watch it on YouTube, but you can't count on that. Sociological, number 3. War, through the medium of military institutions, has uniquely served societies throughout the course of known history as an indispensable controller of dangerous social dissidents and destructive antisocial tendencies. As the most formidable of threats to life itself, and as the only one susceptible to mitigation by social organization alone, it has played another equally fundamental role. The war system has provided the machinery through which the motivational forces governing human behavior have been translated into binding social allegiance. Yeah, they try with the environmentalism. They can bind people in the two sides of the political argument. I think that is kind of a war, though. It has thus ensured the degree of social cohesion necessary to the viability of nations. No other institution or groups of institutions in modern societies has successfully served these functions. Interesting. Interesting. I remember after 9/11, man, people just wouldn't play the race card anymore. Like, it was really cohesive in that immediate aftermath. And then, of course, in New York, people started scamming each other. So the touchy-feely piece went away. But it does do that. I mean, it's dangerous that it does that, because I'm afraid that's why they continue to visit upon us terrible things that affect us all. 4, ecological. War has been the principal evolutionary device for maintaining a satisfactory ecological balance between gross human population and supplies available for its survival. It is unique to the human species. 5, cultural and scientific. War orientation has determined the basic standards of value in the creative arts and has provided the fundamental motivational source of scientific and technological progress. The concepts that the arts express values independent of their own forms and that the successful pursuit of knowledge has intrinsic social value have long been accepted in modern societies. The development of the arts and sciences during this period has been corollary to the parallel development of weaponry. Substitutes for the functions of war. Criteria. The foregoing functions of war are essential to the survival of the social systems we know today. With 2 possible exceptions, they are also essential to any kind of stable social organization that might survive in a warless world. Discussion of the ways and means of transition to such a world are meaningless unless A, substitute institutions can be devised to fill these functions, or B, it can reasonably be hypothecated that the loss or partial loss of any one function need not destroy the viability of future societies. Such substitute institutions and hypotheses must meet varying criteria. In general, they must be technically feasible, politically acceptable, and potentially credible to the members of the societies that adopt them. Specifically, they must be characterized as follows. Man, this is getting a little academic, but it's just summary and it's helpful. It's helpful as a summary. Economic. 1. An acceptable economic surrogate for the war system will require the expenditure of resources for completely non-productive purposes at a level comparable to that of the military expenditures otherwise demanded by the size and complexity of each society. Such a substitute system of apparent waste must be of a nature that will permit it to remain independent of the normal supply-demand economy. It must be subject to arbitrary political control. What about these disasters? I mean, creating disasters, allowing them to happen, you wouldn't believe the resources that are at work in the blast zone just to rebuild houses that were here before. Like, you get fast-tracked if you promise to rebuild the exact house that was there before. I mean, that's one way to really, it's just amazing to me. And the fact that they cleared that, it's cleared. There's 9,000 houses as far as my last report, and they're almost all cleared. It's 5 months. They have a machine, a system for clearing 9,000 houses in 5 months. Like, why does that exist? Where else is that being utilized? And every single truck I saw had California plates. Now, maybe they registered them here because they knew they'd be here for more than 30 days. And I saw hundreds of trucks because mine was the street that they went back and forth. They're not coming back and forth anymore because they're done. And which has greatly elevated my mood, I must say. But that could be part of it. This natural disaster thing, or disaster, should not be underestimated. And I know this guy said he wouldn't write things down. These people said they wouldn't expose actual ideas because they want to use them and they don't want to be outed, although they also predicted that no one would care about this, that it wouldn't change anything. So anyway, 2, political. A viable political substitute for war must posit a generalized external menace to each society of a nature and degree sufficient to require the organization and acceptance of political authority. Okay, so, what are we saying? Terrorism, UFOs, trillions of invisible monsters trying to kill us all, environmentalism. These are external menaces. Okay. Sociological. First, in the permanent absence of war, new institutions must be developed that will effectively control the socially destructive elements of societies. Second, for purposes of adapting the physical and psychological dynamics of human behavior to the needs of social organization, a credible substitute for war must generate an omnipresent and readily understood fear of personal destruction. This fear must be of a nature and degree sufficient to ensure adherence to societal values to the full extent that they are acknowledged to transcend the value of individual human life. Yep. Plague. Ecological, a substitute for war in its function as the uniquely human system of population control must ensure the survival, if not necessarily the improvement of the species in terms of its relation to environmental supply. Cultural and scientific, a surrogate for the function of war as the determinant of cultural values must establish a basis of socio-moral conflict of equally compelling force and scope. A substitute motivational basis for the quest for scientific knowledge must be similarly informed by a comparable sense of internal necessity. Yes, let's see what Stella says here because I think it reflects something I think. Disasters, natural ones, are inevitably, in geologically speaking, badly planned infrastructure. It's just a waiting game of vultures ready to pick at the remains. Yes, I absolutely feel that what happened here, various huge institutions, I've mentioned them before, electric company, the government, the insurance companies, the actual place where the fire started, the risks were identified specifically not that long ago with a timeline that would have been before this, some things after, but clearing that brush before. I think there's just a worldwide understanding that we're okay with stuff like this. We're not going to prevent it. And if you read the insurance company, there's like a place, I read an excerpt of something in maybe the 10K or whatever public filing of insurance company before or after this event. We expect the cost would be $40 billion or $60 billion, and we're capable of absorbing that. So they think about it. They think about they for sure think of ways to mitigate risk. That's a thing. Risk mitigation was huge in the news during the SBF thing, the FTX, the crypto thing. We want to mitigate risk mitigation. That's what a lot of the function of government is, as we expected anyway. All right. So let us this is a natural place to end because now that's where his categories. So next we're going to do summary and conclusions. We're going to continue to we're going to talk about the different ideas they have, the models they're coming up with, how to evaluate the models, the general conclusions, and then he goes into recommendations. And then we also have all that whitewash cover-up stuff. So I thought this was the penultimate episode, but it might be the anti-penultimate episode. We shall see. Anyway, thank you so much for coming. It's always a pleasure. And yes, I had to pre-record a few, but today is live and they will be live for the foreseeable future. And I think I want to do this a little bit later. It's 3:00. We could do 3:00 Pacific, 6:00 Eastern. Is later better? I think later might be better. We'll see. Love you guys. Thank you so much. Whoops. Later.